Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Hello, Al.
Hey, Virgil.
So, folks, we have a one-hour webinar together, right? And before we get into it, it's going to be a packed webinar. It's going to be quite intense. It's going to be quite full on. But before we get into the intensive part of it, let me just start by introducing the speakers, the multiple speakers, the two of us, basically. So I'm very proud to welcome on this webinar Alistair, that I consider one of the best experts of compensation I've ever met. And I'm super proud of having him on board to this webinar to help us walk through the process of creating the first set of salary bands, right? Al, present yourself, introduce yourself a little bit before we dive into it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Virgil. That's a pretty impressive introduction, so thank you. Yeah, I help organizations of all different sizes and shapes bring transparency and consistency to their compensation practices. I use all different types of data, including the figures data. I've been working with Virgil on salary bands for a little while now. Yeah, really looking forward to unpacking how to build salary bands. It's a critical component of any compensation philosophy and structure, and something that a lot of people think is quite tricky, and it really isn't. And what we're going to tackle today is exactly that, to show people that it isn't hard.
I hope that's what people were going to get out of it. That's not that hard, but it's not that simple either. This is why we're making a webinar, right? We wouldn't do this webinar if it was that simple. So we're going to get into it, right? The objective of this webinar for you watching live or you watching on replay is to really try to get you within 1 hour to be confident in understanding what's the process that needs to happen to create salary bands within your organization, right? We want this to be super actionable. And I mentioned it's going to be dense. It's going to be dense in its content because we want to cram as much as possible into this webinar. And we think that potentially you're going to all get the replay. You can rewatch some of the replay once you get into the process of creating salary band. However, we also want it to be quite lively, right? You can ask questions as we go, right? We're going to take questions as we go, because the webinar we're going to walk you through the different steps to create salary bands with Al. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. But if we get any relevant question on the subjects we're presenting, I'm going to highlight them on and take them on, right? So here we go. Let's get started. Let's get started on getting you ready to create your own set of salary bands. Let's go. So, Al, why do we want to have salary band in the first place? Why do we need salary band? Why do an organization need salary band?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I'm going to rattle through them very quickly. I think one of the key ones is to bring transparency to the way that you pay, especially obviously given all of the noise and great noise, shall I say, around the transparency directives coming in the EU and North America. And essentially you're going to be able to show, and by putting salary bands in place, show people what they're paid, why they're paid the way they are. And we'll come on to it in a short while around sort of how you can place people objectively into these band ranges. Furthermore, when you have those ranges, it gives people an understanding of the growth opportunities that you have within your organization. That then motivates employees to set developmental goals. And I think those two things are absolutely critical. Other byproducts, shall we say, of having salary bands, it's super useful for like financial planning. You can be a lot more laser focused on costs, and obviously right now with this current economic climate, that's even more pertinent. And I think again, coming back to the pay transparency element, the sort of final piece around salary bands is getting them on those job adverts. And from a recruiter or talent acquisition standpoint, it makes life so much easier. And again, we're not going to go into the reasons as to why, but it's pretty obvious that having those salary bands on job adverts makes life a hell of a lot easier for both employers and candidates.
But so now you're convinced, hopefully everyone, that it's a necessity, right? But how early can you start creating salary band? Right, 10 employees, you wait till you're 100. What's your take on that?
Personally, I don't think you can start early enough. Like, as an individual, if you're starting out as a founder yourself, a co-founder perhaps, and you're looking to make your first hires, you're going to need to understand what to pay those first hires. And the fact that, and again, we're going to come on to this today, how to create salary bands, in my opinion, is actually pretty straightforward. There's no reason why you shouldn't start from day one. So waiting till later on, there are obviously progressive steps to take in terms of like how many levels you're going to need, roles and things like that, which we're going to unpack shortly. But in my opinion, salary bands from day one is the right way to go.
So it's the right way to go, right? But now that people are convinced, they're like, okay, I need salary bands now.
Yeah.
I think one of the mistakes I see is most people being like, okay, let's go, I'm implementing salary bands. Meanwhile, I think one of the key things is that there's prerequisites to salary bands, which we're going to get into. But first of all, what is a salary band? Because or a salary range, right? We're getting into the topic of the glossary around salary band, salary range, salary grid, pay ranges, compensation ranges, plenty of different vocabulary with no ultimate truth, right? So we're going to use some of the vocabulary that makes sense for us, but you might hear some different vocabulary elsewhere. So salary band, easy enough, a mean, a mid, and a max, right? You have a table view and you have the visual view on our product in figures at the moment. This is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Now, how do you use it? How do you use this salary band in the framework of where do you put employees within those salary bands? And I like the way you explain it and the vocabulary that you use to explain that. I'll walk us through walk us through like positioning employees on bands, depending on their job seniority. Go on.
Yeah, so I mean, just to be clear here, I'm not sort of reinventing or I'm bringing in any new terminology. This is pretty established, like, should we say, terminology within comp and human resources. But essentially, the min is you're new to a level, you're partially meeting job expectations, and that could be new to the organization or new within that level, even if you've moved up a level from the level below. You've then got that sort of midpoint established, and that's someone who's fully competent. And that midpoint is, and we'll come on to it in a minute on how we build our bands, is that's your market data for someone who's fully competent at that role. And then you're going to have the max part of that band, the top end, where people are topping out, fully experienced, highly experienced, should I say, exceeding expectations and sort of ready for a promotion. Now, those descriptions that we've got on the screen there are, they're open to interpretation. Some organizations might have different terminology. They might not have new, established, advanced. But again, this gives you objectivity to place your employees within a band. And again, that further doubles down on the sort of transparency element. So understanding perhaps why I'm at the lower end of the band and paid 52,000, and Virgil is at the top end of the band and paid 68. And it's down to the fact that, well, Virgil is advanced in his role, Alistair, you're new, but let's work you through that band to get you up to, the midpoint and then onto the max and, to the level above in due course. Now, we'll come on to band widths shortly, but broadly speaking, those are the sort of descriptions that you'll tend to find.
And one thing, so we are not going to cover extensively how to use salary bands in the framework of hiring, compensation reviews, and so on. But this is a super useful tool.
Yeah, this is a starting point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So now we're very focused today on the creating this initial set of salary bands, right? But hopefully down the line, we're gonna be giving you some content around how to manage those during hiring and during compensation review.
Yeah.
So now that we've talked about what's a salary band, how to interpret them, is like the prerequisite. We want to cover the prerequisites of salary bands, right? Before you actually get into creating this initial set of salary band, you need to have some stuff in place, right? And often people make the mistake of saying, I'm going to create salary band, let's go. Day one, salary band, I'm building it. And I think both Al and I very much agree that's one of the biggest mistakes company can make, is like you need to make sure you go through some of those steps before you actually create the salary band. And we're going to cover the 4 of them there. Once again, there's been questions. You can ask questions in the chat. If they're relevant to the section we're covering, I'll try to take them on as we go to make this a bit more lively. If not, we'll have a Q&A section at the end anyway to take any question you may have, right? Let's go. Leveling framework. So giving the ability to place or differentiate people per level or seniority levels and so on, right, is a prerequisite, right?
Yeah.
It's 100% needed to build a salary grid, of course, because you need a set of jobs and you need a set of levels to be started. If you don't have that, work on that before working on salary band, right? Yeah. But then same thing, Al, when can you start working on your leveling framework?
Well, I mean,
know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, we did a session on this last year with yourself and Hung Lee, and we spoke, and Pavnik from Unleashed, and we spoke about this, and my position hasn't changed. Like, again, I think you can introduce a leveling framework from day one. It's going to save so many, give you so many headaches if you're trying to sort of, shovel in a leveling framework at a later date. So from my opinion, like from day one, depending on the size of your organization, there might be sort of some nuances to it, but typically, like if you've got on the screen there, sort of 6 levels is pretty standardized. And then you're going to have 2 tracks, an individual contributor track where people are sort of managing processes and becoming specialists, and then you're going to have managers managing people and teams. But my opinion is, again, you can't be early enough with this.
And Al, I feel like I want to have my own leveling framework. Should I create one from scratch because my company is super specific and super unique? Or should I start from a basic?
Yeah, well, look, there's just to be clear, when I talk about leveling frameworks are pretty standardized across the board. That's one thing. Like, yourself at Figures, you've got a leveling framework. You'll find them in other salary benchmarking providers that are out there. I think you've got to sort of sit down and choose one of them. But broadly speaking, they're going to be the same, and they're going to focus around that level's role and responsibilities and the impact you can have. They're not going to typically have the skills and competencies. They're quite unique to your organization, and I would always recommend those being built as a second layer. But firstly, your leveling layer is pretty standard criteria that's out there. So don't reinvent the wheel. Find one that you feel is right for your organization. Maybe tweak the wording in it. There's no harm in perhaps combining sometimes them. So using analogies or things that are specific to your organization in terms of the leveling criteria, but try to keep that standardized.
Yeah, and I was being a bit cheeky because myself, I'm very much aligned with Al on both cases. You can have a leveling framework from day one, and don't start building your own. No. Start off one that makes sense. Have a look at the one we built. In fact, we have 2 leveling framework. One basic leveling framework for early companies and more advanced leveling framework for more mature companies. It's one of the starting points you can use, but really save yourself some time and energy. I think start from an existing one.
You can always tweak a little bit here and there on your one, for example, but try not to deviate too much from it. Like, focus on the next steps that we're going to be talking about, and rather than reinventing the wheel with building a leveling framework from scratch, it's just not the right way to go.
All right, you talked next steps, market data. So, Al, I'm going to be cheeky again once again. Yeah. What do I need market data? I can just go and do salary ranges, define the minimum, the maximum myself. What do I need market data for?
Well, of course, I mean, market data is, well, when we come on to building the benchmarks, the market data is the midpoint, and that's your anchor that you need to build from to figure out what your min and your max is. That market data, as it says there, is to make sure that you've made an informed decision on making sure your bands are trustworthy. So whether you choose Figures, or I'm not going to mention all the other people out there, but there's plenty of other benchmarking providers out there. And it's finding that market data to make an informed decision, and you're not just plucking numbers out of the air. As it says, there are perhaps multiple sources, and you might want to chop and change. So if there's perhaps a blind spot with a particular provider, there is no harm in using another one to help sort of fill in those spots. But say the market data is your midpoint, and then from that, once you have that for each of your levels, then you can build your ranges.
And that we're going to see in the step-by-step. But one point as well, beyond having the data to build like the midpoint of your salary ranges, right? I think an important point is also the credibility that your salary range has will also be dependent on the market data that you have behind it. If you go ahead and tell employees, we're going to make you an offer at the middle of our range, 50K, and the guy is like, okay, but how is the range being built? And you're like, I know the market and whatever. You have much less credibility than by saying, okay, I built those salary ranges using best-in-class market data, like figures, or whatever you want. But the credibility that goes along, it will give credibility to your salary ranges. If you don't, they will lose credibility, and you will spend time arguing with like candidates, employees, managers over the credibility of your salary ranges.
I think the other thing just to note here, the market data that you use, and you know, we've got a visualization there, that 45, 54, etc. That's going to vary dependent on your, I guess, you know, your market positioning for each different job family as well. So whether you want to be paying in the 50th percentile or the 75th percentile and so forth. So those are going to be things. There we go. Yeah. Forgot we had this.
Yeah, you got this. We got exactly, you talked about the natural point. Once you have the market data is like kind of available information. Your North Star into navigating this market data and what to use from this market data should be your compensation strategy. Well, you mentioned that. And it should be, so taking from what you said, you have market data, then is what you make out of it that's important. Do you want to pay median of the market for every role? Do you want to start paying median of the market for some roles and like 70th percentile for tech roles because they are more critical to the success of your organization, or you want to be attractive there? Do you want to pay at the 25th percentile for all roles because you feel like you have other stuff to offer in terms of benefits, in terms of equity? It's super important. Once again, we're in the prerequisite section before building salary bands that you get to nail that down, right? And I think for most, we nearly have mostly HR folks joining today. It's not an HR decision. I think it's and I hope you agree with me, Al. It's like a decision to be taken with like the founding team and so on.
Yeah,
facilitating the decision.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be elements of where you want to be and where you currently are as well. Again, using the figures platform, you can figure where you currently sit. But yeah, it's going to be not just a decision by the people team or, you know, sort of just the execs. You're going to want to get hiring managers' input on those as well, recruiters, lots of different data points to understand, right, where do we need to position ourselves? Where are we? What's our today? What's our tomorrow? And how much is it going to perhaps in some cases cost us to get us to our tomorrow as well? But yeah, that's a key element to figure out what your strategy is per job family.
And if you don't nail that down before starting on salary band, you will feel the effect down the line, right?
Yeah.
You will feel the effect down the line in the sense of you will come to decisions as the manager, you will be facing market data, like, I think the salary range should be this. Says, no, why shouldn't it be this? Meanwhile, if you have said, no, we are looking at this market data point, the 50th percentile, because this is our compensation strategy, therefore this is the truth, right?
Yeah, so making sure that build is an inclusive build is super important. The last thing you want to do, I think we're talking about it in section 3 of this, is when you're communicating it back to the team, we want to make sure that, you know, the managers have been involved in the build process, that they feel comfortable in talking about the ranges, the market data that was used, rather than being a kind of conflict at the end when you sort of present these.
I have a few good questions in the chat, so I'm going to take some of them. I'm going to start with the easiest one. Colette, easiest one, salary band tool is live. This was live yesterday, so if you're interested in our salary band product, you can reach out to the team. We'll share more at the end of the replay. Nicole, very good question from Nicole. And it's a part that we potentially will cover later on as well. How do you make sure your bands still get up to date with fluctuating market data, especially in the current environment, right? In the current environment, we have like inflation going in, we have like a bit of the tech market not doing so well, and so on. So, Al, how often should you update your bands? How often should you look at market data?
Again, like the other things that we'll talk about when building the band, it's a very personal choice. I guess it comes down to the company's you know, kind of ways of working. I think I work with companies that review their market data on a quarterly basis. I work with companies that review their market data, which obviously builds the salary bands, on a biannual basis. And some companies will sort of one and done, set and leave it and do it yearly. So it really, really depends. I think one of the, I guess, key indicators on whether you should be, you know, updating your bands, if there are particular pockets of areas or pockets of you know, people leaving for a particular reason, overpay, right, in a particular team. So you've got high levels of attrition in a team and it's down to pay, or your recruiters are consistently telling you, hey, look, essentially we're struggling to attract talent with the pay that we have. And if they're able to, I guess I would always ask for some sort of data to show me that there is a problem there rather than just hearsay. So how many people have left that team because of pay? How many candidates have we lost because of pay? Did the candidate actually tell you, their expectations on pay? What was the deviation? And like I would always say, you're going to want probably at least 4 or 5 data points in each of those buckets before you can actually say, okay, I think we have a problem here. Let's check the data. But in my opinion, I think that real-time data access through platforms like Figures is great for doing those checks, but you're not going to be changing your market data and salary bands every week or month. I think quarterly is a little bit frequent in my opinion. I think biannually is about the right sweet spot.
So biannually change your
every 6 months.
Or if you see a specific issue on a specific job that like you're struggling to hire for, you have retention issues, right?
Yeah.
And one last point on market data before we move on to the next step. So sometimes what do you think, like, especially when your industries across like health tech or between 2 industries, you have conflicting data source. How do you handle that, right? Question from Hannah.
Yeah, look, there's depending on your provider and the filters that they provide you, and how you can dive in.
We have plenty of those. We have plenty of filters around,
of course. I think it's like finding out where what you're looking for in terms of talent in the market, where you're trying to pull it from, and then comparing yourself to those companies. So I think one of the things, just to sort of say on that side, like there's quite a misconception that, hey, we're Series A, so we should only benchmark ourselves against Series A. It's not always the case. It might be the case for certain roles, but if you're looking for senior experienced talent, you're going to want to broaden your horizon. So there's a bit of an art between, setting up your market data, the filters and so forth. And it's a bit of work to go through those and then start to land on the numbers that feel right for you, because they need to be fiscally, responsible in that sense. Like you're not going to be able to say, right, well, it's saying 110 and the current team's all on 70 at that particular level. If you're going to go out to market with 110, you're going to have to move everyone up to 110 for pay, fairness. Obviously, that's probably not going to be financially viable. So there's a bit of an art to that, and it's something I help organizations do. So finding the market data, choosing the right one is tricky, and it's a bit of a journey in itself.
Yeah, and sometimes I think when you're using multiple sources, you can weight the level of confidence you have in each source at times to make a good call. But that's where it becomes a bit of an art. And this is where I think you have the standard way of building salary band, and sometimes it can be a bit tricky when you're in between industries or with a lot of geographical complexities and stuff like that. This is where it can become a bit tricky, and people like Al can probably help you out. Yeah,
I was going to say lastly on that, I think as well, yes, market data is great, but look internally. Like if you're able, what are you currently paying your team? Because if you're able to continually attract and retain talent with the numbers that you're currently paying, then that's a very good starting point as well. So I think, if you're going to start building your bands, there's a case of looking internally plus at the market, and then you'll find your sweet spot.
We have a lot of very relevant questions in the chat that I think I'll get later on, like on different countries and stuff like that, because I want to get back on one thing we mentioned, which is defining your roles, right? Should I build roles for software engineering, or should I build roles for backend and front-end engineering and have separate bands for those, right? And it's one of the points that we wanted to cover is how granular do you want to be? What's your take on that, Al? Do you want to be very generic? Do you want to be very granular?
I think like if you to move from option 1 to option 3, I think there's like sort of, it depends on company size. I think you're going to probably have high level groupings, as in option 1 there when you're a sort of smaller company, to keep things simpler. And then as you sort of progress in size and have that greater differentiation between skills within roles, you've got people wearing perhaps many hats in the software engineering team in option 2. And then you might want to break them out into that granular front end, back end, full stack at a later date. Again, it comes down to company preference, company size, also market data availability as well, right? again, not going to mention any competitors out there, but some of them won't give you that granularity on whether you're benchmarking for a front end or a back end role. Those two roles would be lumped into just software engineering. I know Figures has all three options, or the first two, sorry, option 2 and option 3. So it comes down to company size. I think also, again, the transparency element and how you communicate back to the team that we value front-end engineers more highly than back-end engineers. So we pay our front-end engineers more. It's actually typically the other way around. But back-end usually earn more than front-end. But it's a case of, if you want to have that conversation and you feel comfortable to say why that is, the market data is telling us this, back-end engineers have a particular skill over front-end and so forth, then go for granularity. It's essentially, I read in an article, I can never remember what it was. I'd say option 2 is like comparing apples to apples. Option 3 is like comparing Granny Smith apples to Granny Smith apples. So you're getting laser focused specificity there, but at the I guess at the cost of perhaps having smaller data pools in terms of the numbers.
Yeah, and this is one, by the way, when you're on board on Benzene Figures, just we're helping you say we have a basic template, which is more like option 1, and a more advanced between option 2 and 3 that help you guide. Once you're creating your salary band, you will have the choice between a basic framework to start with and an advanced framework to start with. I
was going to just quickly say on that last one, Vijay, I do work with clients who want to move from option 2 to option 3, and sort of, as I say, that is not a problem starting off there, but eventually, maybe when you get to an engineering team, for example, of sort of 30, 40 plus, that's probably when you're moving to option 3.
Yeah, you can start wide, like start with option 1 and get to option 2 and then get to option 3, right? You can always iterate on it, right? Yeah. Right. Al, it's time to get cooking. So I feel like I've been listening to Al for a few minutes. I feel like I'm ready to apply some of the things Al said. I'm Al's Padawan, so I want to use a real-time example on how to build a salary band, right? Let's say we want to create a salary band for senior backend developer in Paris. The first thing is to say we want to look at market data, right? We said you look at your market data provider, and this is where we are sharing a link that you can all access, right? That's gonna enable you to view market data. So you view your market data. I'm going to use, of course, the example of Figures, right? This is market data from Figures. I'm looking at market data. We'll share the link in the chat so you can see what it looks like if you don't have Figures. I'm like, okay, senior backend developer. The market seems to be like 66K for a senior backend developer at the 60th percentile, right? Because, and it goes back to my compensation strategy, say I want to pay my tech teams at the 60th percentile. So I'm going to look at market data for the 60th percentile.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to use that to be like, okay, I'm going to use, this is what I was showing, by the way. You should have the link in the chat. That will come up soon. But you're looking at market data. You're looking at the 60th percentile because my compensation strategy says I want to pay at the 60th percentile for my tech roles. I take whatever is the 60th percentile there, and we want to use it. And apply it to create my own salary range, right? So I have taken the 60th percentile, and I'm like, okay, we take the 60th percentile of the senior backend developer, 65K. So interesting. Since the time I created the slides, the market has moved very slightly. Created the slide a while ago. And therefore, we said, okay, this becomes the midpoint of our range, right? The 60th percentile becomes the midpoint of our range. And therefore, we're going to define the max and the mean, the minimum and the max by saying we take the midpoint, the 60th percentile plus 10% and minus 10%. And we're going to get back on how to choose why 10%. I chose 10% just afterwards, but this is a process of creating a salary range. Look at your market data. You use your compensation strategy to define your midpoint, right? And then you say plus 10%, minus 10%. I have a salary range. My salary range has been created. I've created my salary range for senior backend developer in Paris. I looked at market data. I used my compensation strategy that said I want to pick the 60th percentile, and then I have a mean, and then I have a max. that enables me to create my salary range. That's basically the way to create one range, and the range that you see at the bottom with a screenshot of how it looks like in figures. And then you repeat for each level, and that's it. That's how you create it. I've done it for senior. You do it for intermediate. You do it for junior. That's the way you create salary ranges. And of course, this is where a bit of self-promotion. Doing it in Excel takes time. And we, with our new product on salary band, automate the creation of salary bands by saying, you tell us you tell us your compensation strategy. You choose the roles you want to have. So option 1, option 2, option 3. Do you want software engineering or do you want front end and back end? You define your levels, and boom, we generate all the different salary bands for you. I feel like, did I make a mistake, Al, before we start talking about some of the details and the science? Are good?
No, that's pretty much it.
Nice.
It's now defining the widths.
Now defining the widths, right? So defining the widths, how large should your bands and your ranges be is a key question, right? And I use 10% in the example. I use 10%, if you remember on my previous slide, I use 10%. So I started off the midpoint -10 and plus 10%. But why 10%? How do you go along into choosing that bandwidth? Al, enlighten us there. It's a key question. It's one of the most important questions that you have, important choices that you have to make during creation of salary bands.
So I think as we sort of started out when we first talked about this, you're going to need levels, and there's going to be differentiation on bandwidths between levels. These bands, as I say, can be used to, and it's one of the first things I said was like around giving people an understanding of growth within a band and then growth within the subsequent levels and those salary bands. So if you can imagine, let's just say for argument's sake, as your last, if you go back to the last slide quickly, Visual, you've got a back-end developer there, and we've got, if you go back.
No, that's slide, sorry. Yeah,
there we go. You've got, oh no, one more.
Yes,
back.
Yes,
there we go.
Yes,
That's it, yeah. So you've got junior, intermediate, senior staff, right? We've got 4 levels. We're going to make an assumption that this is, to a degree, a lifetime's worth of progression, right? So we want to make sure we have bands wide enough to keep people motivated and engaged, but not too wide that they don't feel like they're progressing quickly enough, but not too narrow that they're progressing too quickly. So it's a bit of an art, and obviously it depends on the number of levels. We're looking at 4 here. Some organizations might have the advanced leveling, as we call it, which is 6 levels. So your bandwidth will slightly vary depending on whether in this case you have 4 or 6, but essentially the bandwidth comes down to the role, how long people expect to, or the hiring managers or the managers within your organization expect people to be in that role. Now, I know time is a bit of a contentious one to use, but let's use time as a proxy to experience within a role. But essentially, you're going to want to design those bands and the width of them based on how long you expect typically people to be in there. So narrower bands, as it says there, for the more junior levels, and then wider bands for the more senior levels. And here's some rough examples of bandwidths, and then the corresponding so bandwidths from the midpoint, and then the total pay range spread from the min to the max. Now, as I say, in the senior levels, you're going to be expected to take on they're going to be wider as a reflection of higher complexity, more responsibility within that role, taking longer to master, and then consequently, they're going to be wider bands. One of the things that I did see, and I did a bit of research this morning on this, and I did a quick bit of crowdsourcing, because obviously salary bands are now being placed on job adverts around the world. And interestingly, and I had it here, one second, Dropbox, for example, and they put on the level, they even put IC1, IC2 on theirs. Doesn't matter whether it was an IC1 role or right up to their staff or VP level, they always had a standard 15% bandwidth plus or minus. So the total pay range spread for them was 35%. And that was for every single level, regardless of seniority.
And what do you think of that, right, Al? Because I'm quite in favor for what we're displaying on screen, increasing bandwidth to allow for longer time in the each level, right? Basically, which makes a lot of sense for me, and it's the type of stuff that I see in a number of more mature company. What do you think of the Dropbox decision to have plus minus 15%, including on like very junior roles and so on?
I think it really depends on. I guess for them, it probably just makes things a lot easier. It's a lot more standardized. I think that will, in some cases, and again, I'd want to dive into the data a bit more, restrict the band range for certainly the more senior levels, because everything is sort of standardized. But again, entirely up to personal opinion. Like it probably as well, it depends on how much band overlap they want between adjacent levels as well, because having
band overlap is a key one. Talk us about band overlap.
Yeah, I guess band overlap, I think the key word there is flexibility. It gives you flexibility, and what we mean by band overlap is, and I had it on your previous image, is like the amount of overlap between the level below and the level above. Some companies will prefer a nice step structure, so there's no overlap at all, and there's a clear delineation between levels. Other companies will have band overlap. I think band overlap is great if you want to, give someone a pay bump within a level. Perhaps they're, close to the top of the level, but they're not ready for a promotion, but you can give them that pay bump. So it gives you a little bit more headroom between levels without getting someone to the top of a level. They're not ready for promotion, but you want to give them a pay bump. So that's what band overlap really is there for.
And I think there's no right call, right? It's one of those type of decisions where you make your own decision, and for example, where I'm quite in favor for progressively larger and larger bands as the level goes. I have no judgment on overlap or no overlap. I think it's 100% the company's call into what they're comfortable with.
Yeah, so I guess it gives people a bit more, or employees a little bit more runway within a level without having to be promoted to the next level, because there might not be a role within the next level ready. There might not be a business need, for example. But it really does come down to personal choice. And also question, the market data points you're using for your midpoint as well will have an impact on that.
And one question about that, right? I think it's, before we move on, I have to take Johannes' question there, because it's quite interesting, right? And it might be a bit of a tricky and technical question for some people. Why are you working 2%? So we're saying we take a midpoint and then we go X%, so like 10% above and below that midpoint. And Johannes is like, why don't you define bands like the beginning of your band will be the 40th percentile, middle of your band the 50th, top of your band the 60th?
You can build like that. I have seen people build like that. It's not a personal preference for me. I think the variance between levels, so if you chose the 40th, the 50th, and the 60th for level 1, and then the 40th, the 50th, the 60th for level 2, I have built like that before. And sometimes you can have quite huge overlaps between the 60th of level 1 and the 40th of level 2. The overlaps get quite large. It also, it depends on your provider as well. Like some providers don't go into that granularity. So if you're to use one of the other ones out there, beginning with a P, based in the US, you might have the 25th, the 50th, and 75th. That's a huge range sometimes.
And we show, because we enable people to show 40th, 50th, and 60th in figures, but not everyone does. But to your point also, when you do the ranges like that, you're too dependent on market data. You might end up having a lot of overlap, or on one roll, you might have 40th and 60th being quite close, and another roll very wide. You might have ranges that are all over the place because they're too dependent on market data specifics. So I'm really much more in favor, like Alan, midpoint plus or minus certain percent.
I have built them that way before, and it gets very messy very quickly.
I agree with you. All right, let's get to communicating so that we ensure we have time for more Q&A. There's some good questions in the chat I want to get to. And the fact that we want to potentially rush a bit through communication doesn't mean it's not important, right? Often, I think it's an overlooked step, especially there's always this thing with HR. They've done their salary band, they feel they're at the end of the process, they got the salary band approved by their leadership, and they're like, okay, process is over, right? But it's far from over. It's far from over because in a way, there's a lot of the next chapter is the communication around that. First point on pay transparency, we define 4 levels steps in terms of transparency. That I like to say that you can be non-transparent, or you can start being transparent on your compensation policy, saying like you pay at the median of the market, saying that you want to pay at 60th percentile and stuff like that. You can be transparent on processes, meaning you shed more light on how is determined the salary or the starting packages when you're hiring someone, how does compensation review works, who gets what, and so on. You can be transparent on the models, like being transparent on your salary band model, on your equity model, and so on. And then transparency, level 4, the ultimate transparency, is the one where you're transparent, fully transparent on who earns what in your company, who has what salary, who has what equity, which is what we have at Figures, by the way. What's your take on pay transparency? What should company aim for, Al?
You're right, it's a journey, and there's different steps to get there. I think you set your North Star as being super transparent, up to the point of perhaps not the buffer, let's show everyone what we're paying everyone individually, but set your North Star, but whatever that is, and then work your way towards that in these steps. I think my view from transparency, and I think we talked about this before, is not what the number is for a level 2 or a level 3 or a level 4 customer success manager is. Yes, that's great. Tell me that's important. I want to understand how you arrived at that number. Where did you pluck that number out of? Because look, I've been there where it's been as we call it, like a black box of calculations. It's been stuff that's been crowdsourced from, I don't know, Glassdoor or LinkedIn, or an email that was going around that had a salary report, data set on from Mercer from, I don't know, 2008. It's like, it becomes a mess. So I think bringing clarity to where the numbers actually came from is super, super important. Like we talked at the beginning, having that, hey, this came from Figures. This is how Figures, you can go and check out how Figures collect data. You're very open about the companies that contribute to your data set. That's what transparency means. When I used to work with other data sets, and one of the things that came out when we used to talk about this is like continuously people wanted to know, okay, I will use data set XYZ, great, but who is contributing to data set XYZ? What are the companies that are contributing to it? You can go a step lower than that, and you can start talking about percentiles if you wish. You can start talking about the filters you applied. We only benchmarked ourselves for companies that have raised up to 100 million, or companies in this particular industry. That's the degree of transparency that you need to get to.
Yeah, and I think so. We have 1,200 companies using Figures. Of course, we don't talk to all of them. But when I talk to many of those that's been using over the year, when they achieve that level of transparency, say, hey, those are the salary bands. This is how we build them. We were looking at Series A and B companies in France within Figures. We have positioned ourselves in the 60th percentile. This is what we use to define those bands. The level of credibility and trust you generate is so much higher than just saying, hey, this is a salary band. This is what you get paid, period, right? And I agree with you. I think companies should trend toward that anyway. And anyway, as we mentioned briefly, but is that new EU pay directive will force companies that don't want to be transparent to be more and more transparent. So it's better to start taking that journey now before being forced to by legislation or by the market adapting, because more and more companies are going to adapt, right? I posted something yesterday to show that Airbnb announced that's going to be sharing all salary ranges and job advertising in the US now, and in the rest of the year, in the rest of the world very soon, right? Before it becomes the law. And that will become more and more the norm, I think.
Agreed.
Moving on to sharing your bands. So what's your process on, like, you define your bands, you started creating your bands, you started validating them with leadership, assuming that's what are the next step into sharing those bands, right? Who do you share to? What do you think companies are being the most standard way of action into progressively sharing those bands afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, if I take one step back there, when you said about creating those bands with the executive team, I'd actually, when I build bands with companies and I work with them, I go, a couple of steps lower, and let's build them with the managers who are going to be the ones recruiting against these, promoting against these, to make it an inclusive process. So once you have buy-in from those people, and that could go down to an M3, like a lead, an entry-level manager. Once you have buy-in from them, that's going to make your whole communication process a lot easier, as we talked about before. And then sharing the bands, then essentially is a case of then making them public internally to your team. How you do that, there's obviously different ways you can do that. I think the wrong way I've seen this done in the past is there's been companies that do the exercise and then they just start putting salary bands on job adverts without telling the people who are already doing the job. Because they're, hey, we put salary bands on job adverts. Don't forget to tell your internal people where they sit and their level and why they're paid X. So I think sharing with everyone, as you say, putting them onto to job adverts will be, become the norm in the next few years, especially with the EU Paid Transparency Directive. And I think even with companies that aren't in the EU, like, in the UK, for example, will just follow suit because it's the right thing to do. I know there's obviously different ways you can set up sharing bands in figures. I work in spreadsheets and I've built sort of, interactive, and we've seen them out there, right? There's companies that have posted these things on LinkedIn and so forth, where, they'll set a live Google Sheet where it can be a candidate or it can be someone internally. You can go in and play around and say, I'm a level 3 customer success manager in France. Tell me what my range would be. So yeah, there's lots of different ways. I'll let you dive into how to share in figures.
Yeah, no, but I mean, in figures, is you can share with whoever you want, right, in our new product, but we really tailor the product with what the pain I face as an HR person in the past, right, is I've had, like in Criteo, for example, but multiple of my company, we had those master salary bands file in Excel, and then we had to create a separate file for tech, a separate file for sales, a separate file. It was an absolute nightmare, right? So this is what sharing restricted access to salary ranges to specific managers or recruiters and so on is something that I think is the most impressive part of what we built in figures. Trying to answering a few questions right now quickly on the pay directive that we keep mentioning. No, new pay directive will force selling salary ranges on job ads, not individual salaries, right? It won't be there. They won't be there for a while. And this new directive will be passed into law within the next 3 years in each country. So maybe it'll be next year, maybe it'll be a year after, but it's coming quite soon to you. I'm going to start taking questions now. We had a few questions, still time to ask some of your questions. I want to get back to some of the questions that were upvoted by people. One by Antoinette that was pretty interesting, right? So Antoinette has employees and contractors in different countries, life of an HR nowadays, right? But she has only one salary band. And like, what is that best practice to have like one salary band regardless of location? Should you adjust per cost of living? Shouldn't you? I know it's a question you've gotten 200 times.
Hour.
Yeah, exactly. So is there a way to give some quick hints on how to deal with geographical differences? Because yes, you can spend 1 hour on what the options you have. Do you have like some quick wins there?
Look, there's some pretty pragmatic ways to do that. Taking that salary band within a country where it's set and you're happy with it, and then essentially applying a sensible, what I call like location multiplier, or you might hear the term location differential, to account for the differences between your base or HQ market and the market, the new geographical market you're going to be hiring in, based on cost of living, cost of labor, and your philosophical beliefs on what is the right way to pay people based on, is it, equal pay for equal work, so they're paid exactly the same, so there's no difference? Is there geographical differences? Do you have a flaw in your pay strategy? Do you pay someone in New York 100,000 and pay someone doing the same role in the Philippines 15,000? Like, what is the sort of flaw for that? So there's lots of different things to do there, but broadly speaking, it's arriving at a number that accounts to take that salary band, and either essentially is it less or more expensive in the other location, and add on or take off a percentage. That's pretty much the quickest and most pragmatic way to do it. But you've got to have a reason behind that percentage. It's got to come from somewhere and can't be just pulled out of a hat.
Yeah, and I think 2 points on there, right? One philosophical one is that this is something that should be part of your compensation philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? We talked about compensation philosophy being where you want to position yourself on the market. It's also how do you want people pay per geography? Do you want to align everyone? Do you want to pay per country? Do you want to pay per city? For example, at Figures, we decided to pay everyone per their city capital, right? So people in France, wherever they live, are going to pay in Paris. In the UK, it's going to pay London rates. We made that call with my co-founder, but so the co-founder is like the decision that drives off all of our actions afterwards, right? And then we can explain to employees, this is why we made that call. And this is something that each company needs to make, once again, is part of their compensation philosophy.
I was going to say quickly on the other one as well, with contractors as well, something that I've noticed that I end up doing quite a lot of very quickly on that is you might have a contractor and an employee in the same country. You're going to probably have your contractor on a higher salary. So there's going to be a case there as well. So taking your full-time employee salary out of Figures, your market data, and then adding on a premium to account for the fact that they're a contractor. They pay their own taxes. They don't get any of the benefits and perks and all of that sort of good stuff. So there's an element there as well. Again, similar to location multipliers, you want to add on a kind of contractor multiplier as well.
Yeah, I once again can do a full webinar on that. It's really a really tricky topic, I think, and a complex one, but one that you should tackle once again before building salary bands, right? And I think it's one that you have to tackle early on as part of your philosophy before you make any actions. I have a question on Lucas. It's interesting because something I heard also very much recently. What do you think about making the range so that the lower limit is at minus 10% and the upper limit is at like say 15%? So basically not having a min and max, but because like the lower part is smaller or wider, or the upper part is wider than the lower part, or things like that. What do you think of it, and do you see it as common on the market? I'll reserve my opinion before I hear yours.
Yeah, I'll be brutally honest. I've never come across that.
So I've come across that recently, but I don't understand it, and that was the first time ever I saw.
I've never come across it. I guess a lot of the companies I help don't even know where to typically usually start with salary bands, so they're relying on me. I've done a lot of work on this and a lot of reading and learning, and I've never come across that before. I don't know why you would want to do that. I can't think of any benefits off the top of my head right now.
I don't. Not me neither. If you have some benefits that you want to share in the chat, please do, because I was a bit taken aback as well by hearing companies that does that, right? It makes sense to me more complex to manage. I don't fully get what you want to do with it.
I think that would have quite a tricky trickle-on effect when you start doing pay equity audits and calculating people's position and range and compa ratios and things like that, because again, all of that stuff is pretty standardized, right? So if you're then messing with the way that the range is being created, which again is pretty standardized out there globally, it's a standard set of mathematical equations you use, I think that would lead to some quite confusing outputs. Personally.
I agree with you. I have a quick question there that from Ula, which was on compensation philosophy, because we talked about it, right? She says very much like, how do you see culture informing compensation philosophy? That's one question. There's a second question. I think so. I think the compensation philosophy is a subset of the company culture. It's part of your company culture, right? Our company culture, for example, part of our compensation philosophy is to be fully transparent on individual salaries. It's a subset of our company policy to be a very transparent company. So I see it's a cultural element, it's a strong cultural element. And I think to your second point, when creating a different percentile for different job family, is like, how much is that a company be comfortable with like people being paid at the median and tech being paid at the 70th percentile? Have you seen some companies making that choice and like having some pain points into communicating that choice or assuming that choice towards employees?
You know what, I do tend to talk about, when I talk about percentiles and where you choose your market position, actually then personally, it's a difficult conversation to have if you start talking about percentiles and you say, we pay in the 75th for software engineers and we pay in the 25th for customer success. Because essentially, you know, that's a market leading and market lagging if you take your 50th as the median. So it does open up a Pandora's box. I tend to tell clients, look, it's useful to talk about percentiles when you're setting and creating your market strategies, but when communicating that widely, There's just this is the range for engineering, this is the range for customer success. You're going to see there's going to be differences, right? There's going to be differences, but those differences come down to the fact that there's completely different skill sets at play there. And like you said before, setting those percentiles depends on what is of strategic importance in those two. You know, you might have a compensation philosophy that, you know, you don't pay any of your teams in anything below the 50th. It's the 50th and above. That's absolutely great, but can you actually afford to do that? That's always what I would then turn around and say to the organization. And yeah.
And to play devil's advocate there, like I know a few companies, and in fact, one of our great clients, Gorgias, has an open source to compensation policy where they say we pay at the median, but 70th percentile for tech. And they just say, we think that tech is more overall, as an average, impactful for our organization. But we recognize that people, even if we want to pay at the median, it doesn't prevent us from rewarding top performers that impact the organization while being non-tech in a meaningful way, right?
Yeah. I think
go for
talking about the 50th and above is like, it's an easier conversation, right? But talking about, hey, we pay in the 10th percentile or the 25th, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're able to continually attract and retain talent there, then that's your market rate and there's not a problem with it. But telling people that 75% of companies pay more is quite a bitter pill to swallow, I'd imagine, if you're an employee. So I think, yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. I'm not going to lie.
Last question before we wrap this up, and we go have lunch. Like, how the question, like from Hannah, is like overlapping bands, right? How do you explain that people could have earned the same but are on 2 levels difference, right? Which is a case study of like when you have overlapping bands, you can have someone at the high and to the intermediate scale earning same thing than someone at the senior level, right?
Yeah, I think cases like that might be if you've got sort of someone who's been hired new into the organization, they're coming in at the bottom of the band, they're new to the organization, they're building up their skill level at say level 3, and then you have an existing employee at level 2, not ready for promotion, but has, you know, essentially been promoted to as far as essentially they can get within their band, and you're basically rewarding them at the same level of the person who's new to the level above, right? That's probably where, you know, you'll have those use cases, and then that person is then hopefully ready for promotion, but perhaps they're not, but you're rewarding them for their contribution to date, versus the new person who's come in at the the level above, right? You've hired them in at the level above through your recruiting process, but they're at the bottom of that band and they're being rewarded exactly the same as the person who's been there the same time. And that to some degree brings an element of fairness to it. But yeah, overlapping bands is a tricky one, the concept of that, and I find a lot of people find it quite difficult. I personally like clear-cut step structures, but I like things nice and neat and tidy.
And I think, and we'll wrap this up on that, I've been working with overlapping band, and to me, also my argument was that, is there really that much of a huge step between a very advanced and someone very advanced in the intermediate role and someone just starting on a senior role? It's more of like people, when they become senior, they just don't suddenly get 10 centimeters taller, way more efficient at their job. It's more of a curve. We put levels. So advanced, intermediate being the same as a very new and beginning senior is not that crazy to me. Wrapping this up because it's time for that. You'll be all receiving our ultimate salary bands guide. We've been putting a lot of work on creating basically what we've shown through the webinar, but in actionable steps with more example, more time, more glossary, and so on. That you will all receive that soon. I don't know how soon, but soon, I swear. And of course, if you're interested by our new salary bands module and how we can help you create, update, and share salary bands within your company, you can get to talk to our team. I'm sure someone will be very likely to talk to you in the next few days. That's it. I want to thank Alistair, I want to thank you for participating in this call. I think it was quite dense, it was compact, but I hope it was actionable for all of you. And I hope you get something very actionable to get building those bands thanks to this webinar. And if, once again, you're in a very specific company situation, you want to be more finer or more granular into building those bands, someone like Alistair can help you out, right? You can do that, Alistair.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, if you want to, instead of building those bands into Excel, build them into figures, you'll be more than welcome to come and join us for that. Thanks for your attention, folks. Thanks to all of you watching in replay, which is more and more those days. Have a great end of the day, great end of the week, and see you soon.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.